I'm Caitlin Dryden, and this is Slut. I'm Caitlin Dryden, and welcome to Slut, the show where I question who is and what makes a slut. I don't know about you, but it has been a wild spring. So much has happened, and a lot has happened in my dating life. I've learned a lot, and I will be talking about it in the coming months on the show. But for today, we are going to be talking with Michelle T. Michelle is a writer, and she's written over 20 books. It's just crazy how many novels she has out there. You may know her book, Valencia, or Knocking Myself Up. And maybe you also know her through Sister Spit, which was a performance tour she co-founded back in 1997, and it still runs today. And if you don't know her from those things, you may inadvertently know her through Drag Queen Story Hour, which is an idea that she came up with back in the mid-2000s. Michelle came over about a month ago to talk about Sluts, the first anthology she edited from her new publication company, Dopamine Press. And the goal of Dopamine is to elevate LGBTQIA writing and writers and nurture queer work that falls outside of the mainstream. Sluts explores what it means to be sexually promiscuous today and investigates how the notion of slut impacts our inner and outer lives as a threat or identity, a punishment or aspiration, a lifestyle, an aesthetic, a philosophy, or a rallying cry. So obviously, this was the perfect book to talk about on the podcast, and I'd say Michelle is a perfect slut guest. We ended up talking for over 2.5 hours, so I decided to split this episode in half. And the first half is obviously coming out today, and the second half is coming out next week on May 7th, which is the same release day for Sluts. So I could say more about Michelle and her life, but you will be hearing lots of it soon. So I know that all you sluts are wet on the edges of your seat, and let's just get to it. Michelle T is up next. Michelle, you've been a professional oversharer for decades and a slut, but you've just started your own publishing company, Dopamine Press. And the first release comes out at the beginning of May. It's an anthology called Sluts, which the likes of Amanda Montell, Cyrus Dunham, Leah Rue, Brontes Purnell all contributed to. And we have lots to talk about in terms of slutdom and your life and all your work, but I want to start off with your passage from the book, and I was wondering if you could read part of it for us.
Sure. Oh my goodness. You know, I write these things in a fugue state and then barely remember what they are.
I want you to start page 10,
okay.
putting this book together.
Okay, let me find it. Where does it say that?
Let me see.
Oh, there it is. I found it. Yeah, sorry. Okay, cool. Putting this book together as a cis woman and mom in a queer marriage that theoretically allows for some possible misbehavior, but for all intents and purposes is totally monogamous. I was really interested in slut as a concept. If a slut stops being slutty, is she still a slut? Can one be culturally slutty? Can I be a slut within the bounds of monogamy? It actually says, can one be a slut? But clearly this is personal. Is slut an identity like queer that can go through various iterations throughout a lifetime? Is being a slut sort of like being a writer, something you just are, born that way? I don't think I was born queer. Was I born a slut? Did my sluttiness actually cause my queerness? Or did my queerness cause my sluttiness? It certainly enabled it. I recall being young and sexual and understanding that it was sex with men that made one a slut. A girl fooling around with girls, I was, what, a fairy princess? That's what it felt like. Maybe all things being equal for a slut like myself, I migrated to queerdom permanently because it is such a free place to slut it up. Good thing it's a galley, but it's too late. It already went to print. Okay, cool.
Editing in real time.
Editing in real time. A cis guy could think a girl was a slut for literally giving him the very thing he was hoping for, sex. What ingrates? Whereas like-minded queers got it. Sex was hot fun, like devouring a pizza. Eat up. That's my story, I guess, but what's yours? That's what I was hoping to find in this book. The way slut is weaponized at such a young age, the way it can be reclaimed in adulthood, the glamour and the heartbreak of sluttery, the pressure to be a slut, and maybe at core, how sluttery is just about hunger, desire, hedonism. There are professional sluts in this book, among the bravest of the sluts, because though the literal word slut has become so mainstream that a person can use it to name a chain of breakfast restaurants, being committed enough to body and sexual autonomy to defy law and involve it in a strategy to survive capitalism, this is still, even today, boringly controversial and dangerous. Everyone who shared their relationship with this word, and by extension, their relationships with other people and their bodies, with their own bodies and senses of shame or entitlement, daring and embarrassment and power, I do think they are quite brave and wonderful storytellers to boot. Oh, I like my intro. I thought I did it.
It was great.
I forgot what I wrote. I forget what I write, and then I just immediately assume it's bad.
I think I remember. I think it was in one of your interviews. You said that you like just basically throw up on the page and put it all down, and you don't like to edit and go back.
I don't like to, but I usually do, except in a situation like this where, Dopamine is a collaboration with Semiotext, and so I work closely with Eddie El-Kulti, who is the publisher of Semiotext, and I super just respect and admire the crap out of him. He's so great. And he was like, I think Sluts needs an introduction. And I was like, okay. I knew in my heart it did, but I was trying to get out of it because I'm lazy. So I just sort of like, I threw it up on the page and then I just sent it off, and no one was going to edit it because I'm the editor. You know what I mean? So I edited everybody else's work, but I didn't edit my own.
That's good. But that slut.
Yeah.
Slut as a concept is where I want to start.
Sure.
One of the rhetorical questions that you asked in that was, can one be culturally slutty?
Yeah.
So I'm going to turn that back on you. Can one be culturally slutty?
I think one can, because if we go back to sort of what I think of as the root of the word slut in contemporary times, I'm not talking about medieval times and everything, but, I think most of us today have like encountered that word as a pejorative, right? I'm pretty certain I was called a slut when I was younger, before I ever had sex.
Yeah, same here. I know I was. Yeah.
Exactly, right? So I think a lot of people, especially a lot of girls, get called a slut, and it's a total fabrication. It's just an insult, and it's a way to scare and control. But there's something really interesting, because it's like, what is being perceived if you're not actually being slutty? If you're not even being sexual and you're being called a slut, what is being hurled at you? And I do think that there's sometimes some sort of difference or brazenness or inability or unwillingness to sort of fall into a sort of feminine line, that is being detected by the people who are using that insult to control and to punish, that makes me think that, slut is sort of larger than just whether or not, you feel sexually free or, it doesn't, I do think that there's an element of it where it's sort of like a powerful archetype in a way. And, I feel like you can be kind of like slut adjacent or slut centric or slut appreciative, and that a slut by association with other sluts, like, and so all of these things feel sort of cultural in this way where, you appreciate maybe, sluttishness in others. And even if you're not yourself a slut, it's sort of like you're willing, you've been hurt, or, there's been an attempt to hurt you with that word, and you've had to sort of reckon with it. Yeah. So it ultimately doesn't necessarily even matter if you are literally like
a slut or not.
Yeah.
See, the reason why that question really stood out to me is because I think that I'm culturally a slut. Like I have very big breasts. I'm like a curvy woman. The way I just like present to the world is coded as slut. So slut was placed on me before I even like really understood it or understood sexuality. You understand, I guess, like being in line as a woman at a certain age, but it was placed on me.
What a compliment. Whether or not it's true or not, I feel like it's just always, it's always just, it's a compliment.
It's a compliment. Is that how you read it?
Yeah, sure. That like, cause it would suggest that you possess a sort of freedom and liberation. And of course, it's like, not that you can't possess those things and also be like monogamous or whatever. But I just think it's ultimately saying, oh, there's something like wild and free and like sexually attractive about you, right? So, it's a compliment, I think.
Do you feel like you're culturally a slut?
I do. Yeah, I do. Because I'm so identified with the word, even though like, it's at least right now in my life, like I'm not slutty at all. Like I'm a slut for my husband, but that's all that's been going on for the past like 4 years. Yeah.
And the other thing that stood out to me was you said that you weren't born queer, but maybe you were born a slut. So you don't think you were born queer?
No, not at all. I mean, I think that I was born with the sort of nature that I possess. Queerness is part of that nature for sure, but I just have never related to that sort of like, I'm wired in this hardcore way and I can't be any other way. Like I do believe in the multiverse. There's probably lots of iterations of myself where I wound up, with a cisgendered man and that's my story, and maybe was like theoretically bisexual, because of having a sort of openness.
Okay.
But I think that what happened for me was that I do have an openness to life and not, I'm very questioning of taboos and things like that. And when I was younger, when I was like 19, 20, I had a boyfriend that was like, wouldn't it be cool if you made out with a girl? And I was like, yeah, I was like, that would be, you think it'd be cool? Okay. Yeah. Then I think it'd be cool too. Cause like, there was I didn't think that it was like bad to make out with a girl. I thought about it, but it didn't necessarily move me that tremendously. But then I started making out with girls with my boyfriend. It was like my new hobby. It was like so fun. And then I fell in love with this girl and I just found it so much more gratifying and exciting. And
what was more gratifying about it?
There was a level that we just got each other that I felt like me and my boyfriend didn't. And my boyfriend was pretty cool. I really, we had problems for sure. We had places where we didn't match up, but he was pretty cool. But I felt like me and, the girl that I really felt for matched up in this other way. And I felt like there was something, I think there's something devotional about me and about the way that I love and certainly the way I have sex. And having a feminist consciousness, even that young, where it was just beginning to come out. It's hard to be very devotional to a cis guy. They're not necessarily worthy of it, and it can be really misinterpreted, I think, and there was something about feeling sort of devotional to this experience with this other girl that felt really correct and safe.
Yeah.
And
interesting.
Yeah. And
I guess, what does it mean to be devotional to a man?
Right. I do feel very devotional towards my husband, but he's also a trans man. And I do feel like there's something so sacred and special about that experience and about trans people in the world and stuff. Especially having been in relationships with cisgendered men, it feels there's a totally different vibe. The vibe is really different and so preferable, And then it even took me a very long time to figure out, that I was like, okay, so wow, I do like quote girls, and then I was like, oh, and then I realized that they were like masculine girls. And I was like, whoa, wait, what? And then that blew my mind. Yeah, super jackpot. And then I was like, oh, wait, some of these masculine girls are actually this other kind of man. Wait, what? Wow. So it's just been a path of, learning as like the world opening up right before me and me feeling like, oh, what a great time to be alive for me that I get to get so closer and closer to the heart of my own desire via other people.
How do you think your slutdom has changed throughout your life?
I think I used to be really scared of my inner slutdom, you know.
I feel scared. Yeah. The power that it like possesses.
Yeah, it is really powerful. And the power, it's not necessarily like it. I think when I would think of that, it's not necessarily like, oh, then I become Wonder Woman or something, but it's just more like, whoa, it is a powerful experience to let that aspect of yourself, which so often, because it is sexual and because maybe it's hidden and there's attachments, it's been touched by, you know, shame and all these other more subterranean parts of yourself, that it can be attached to your shadow a little bit. And there's so much power there, you know, like I think it's a powerful internal experience. But yeah, I remember like with that first boyfriend, the one that was like, don't you want to kiss a girl? Like when I was younger, my whole life, ever since I started being sexual, I had an interest in sort of like BDSM, but like didn't understand exactly what it was and like what I wanted. But I remember him being really frightened by it, which made me frightened by myself. Like, oh no, like there's this thing inside me that wants bad things and I should be really careful because I'll, you know, put myself in bad situations and then I'll be like a stupid girl who put herself in a bad situation and terrible things will happen to me and it'll be my own fault. And, you know, so it was like this whole narrative happening. And, you know, and I mentioned this in the introduction, like it was a real revelation to come to San Francisco, which I did in my early 20s on the heels of a breakup, to stay with my best friend who was living there and find this whole culture that was happening in the Mission District in the 90s. And it was this dyke culture that was very punk informed. It was very BDSM informed. It was wild. And just, you would walk into a club and there would literally be somebody getting their ass spanked, like bare ass, like right in the foyer of the club. And you're like, oh, hey, you know, and it's like people were into doing wild, like very physical performance art.
I remember that like knife experience that you had. You were writing about it in Valencia.
Yes. Yeah. And that was very common to like go home with somebody and they pull a knife on you and you're like, wow, you know, like I think I've always wanted this and not let myself really think about it because of what the implications could be in a heterosexual context. But
yeah, because I was just about to say, like, that could only happen in a queer context where you're not like, oh, I need to run out the door immediately.
Right.
Because that woman had a hunting knife.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like that's crazy.
Yeah. And even in the story in Valencia, as I was writing it and I was writing about my internal reaction and I'm just like, oh my God, is she going to kill me? Like, you know, that was even putting that in there was for effect because obviously that is what you would think. But honestly, it doesn't reflect the sense of that. Of course she wasn't going to kill me. I knew that she wasn't going to kill me. I knew what was happening.
But that's what makes sex thrilling, right? Especially when you're meeting somebody for the first time and they could kill you in any moment. They like, you know, that hand around your neck a little too tight.
It's hot, you know, if you like that, then you probably really like that. Yeah. And it's, you know, a complicated thing to figure out, I think, while you're also figuring out the power dynamics of heterosexuality and the very real safety concerns of heterosexuality. And, you know, you can be like physically safe with, you know, like a cis guy, but that doesn't mean they're not also
emotionally.
Yeah. Or like even just sort of like misperceiving you. You know what I mean? And I don't know. I'm a person who has always felt sensitive to that. There was just something when I realized like, oh my God, I can just really explore all of this shit right here with these people who are so hot and who are also exploring it. Yeah. And there's no judgment and there's no anything. And it's like, these are all these wild, feral queer girls who were, you know, really pushing the boundaries of their own experiences and really inviting you to join them. And it was really amazing. And it took me a long time to kind of like circle back around to cis guys because truly all of my needs were met.
So you have circled around to cis guys?
Yeah, I have. Well, what happened for me was I was in a relationship with somebody who transitioned to male.
Mm-hmm.
And then as that was happening, my community, so much of my community, a lot of the people that I was sort of like attracted to, or a lot of the masculine spectrum people in my community transitioned to male. And so it just brought the issue of men back up in my life. And I had to sort of deal with the fact that, because it was, I just feel like it's really easy to like, and I feel like culture really encourages, I think, especially queer people to be like, this is the real me. I've come out and now I found the real me, and it's like you're almost encouraged to disregard your entire history, which is bullshit. And it's only because it's only like if we are super pathological and we insist that there's no other way we can be, that's the only way we can kind of get basic rights. We have to almost, you know what I mean?
I was just about to say, it's because you like have to just affirm that you're a human and you deserve basic respect. And so you like cling onto like, this is who I am. I'm going forth now and nobody can take this away from me.
Yeah. And it's bullshit. It's like, no, I just want different things at different times and none of it's bad and all of it's great. And like, so yeah, it's, so I definitely like when I was like dyking out for decades was just sort of like, I was just like, men, gross, ew, yuck, even during those time periods, I did have little, like I've had crushes on cis guys who were sort of very queer centric cis guys. And one arguably, it maybe wasn't a guy after all, we'll never know. But once my partner transitioned, you can't really be a man hater and talking shit about men all the time and then support your partner exploring their own masculinity and their place in the world as a man and stuff. So it was really great for me. I'm really grateful, even though there were lots of bumps and growing pains. It was super, super helpful. And interestingly, around this time too, I became sober and I was suddenly—
This is when you're 32.
Yeah, in my early 30s. Yeah. I was suddenly kind of thrown into community with cis guys through recovery programs, right? Where suddenly I'm seeing cis men in this very vulnerable state where they're having to get honest about things and they're having to get vulnerable. It was really great. It was like suddenly— And, I also was sort of waking up to the role that alcoholism and addiction has had in my life for forever, since I was like in my early teens. And it suddenly became really illuminated as like, not necessarily the most important part of my identity, but certainly inextricably linked to every other sort of intersectional identity I have. The addict played into it in some way. It had a relationship with the way I was female, the way I was queer, the way I was a writer, the way I sort of identified with being working class. Like all these things were totally like wed to my addiction. And so it suddenly felt like actually the most important thing about myself isn't that I'm queer or a feminist. It's kind of that I'm an addict. And because of that, I actually have more in common with these dudes than I do with like, another queer person who might have never experienced addiction. So, nothing is that cut and dried or black and white, but it was a revelation to suddenly feel an intense kinship with these guys, and really understand them and feel understood by them.
Yeah, I love that you just brought this up because I wrote this down. This is something that I wanted to talk to you about. I talk to lots of different kinds of sluts, some professional, some not. And something that I've noticed in almost all of my conversations is the concept is talking about substance abuse. It's literally almost every one of my interviews, we talk about addiction.
Interesting.
And so I guess I wonder, like, what do you think is the slut's proclivity to addiction?
That is such a great question. And it's so interesting. I have often felt that my personal addiction, and everybody has, all people who've had these experiences with substances that have gotten out of control sort of have their own relationship with like the whys and the hows. But for me, it felt like a disease of more. Like I need more. And it feels like I'm wired like that in so many ways.
Yeah.
Like I've always been like, oh, well, if I like a little bit of this, then I'd like way more of this, like, oh, this recipe calls for 2 cloves of garlic. Obviously we want 15 cloves of garlic because garlic is great. So it's sort of like, that's a really funny way to think of it. But like put that template on anything and I'm really likely to overdo anything that gives me pleasure, right? Anything that gives me dopamine.
Yeah.
You know, I will probably overdo it. And I certainly felt that way about substances. It was like, oh, you know, if like one drink makes me feel a little fun, how will 3 drinks feel? You know? And it's like totally that. And it's like, oh, well, if, you know, going out and partying one night a week is fun, why wouldn't I want to go out and party every night of the week? Why wouldn't I want every night to be a party?
So it's more like, sex, more fun, more everything.
And and sex is so tied into that, and the way that substances are sexy, right? And that they can make you feel sexy, and they can lower your inhibitions and make you braver, and, you know, alter your relationship to like physical pain or discomfort. Like all of those things are sort of all intertwined, I think. I'm not surprised to hear that, but it is really interesting that you've noticed that.
Yeah. Do you think that like sluthood can exist without addiction?
Well, I said yes very quickly because I'm sober and I was a slut while I'm sober, but I'm like, is the sluttiness an addiction? I mean, I think that's an interesting thing to think about. Like my therapist is always very quick to remind me that like there really is no like sex addiction in the DSM. You know? Not that we necessarily care about the DSM. You know, and I appreciate that. You know, and I'm certainly in no rush to pathologize desire or the amount of desire a person feels compelled to have. But I also understand addiction in this particular way as an addict, that before I sort of went into recovery and learned about my addiction through the process of becoming sober and working with other addicts, and I never believed in something like love addiction or sex addiction or, you know, shopping, all those things. I was like, God, people just want to pathologize like everything's fucking fun, you know? God, so stupid. But what I began to more realize or consider is that, you know, there is like a neurochemical thing that happens within addiction that has a lot to do with the pleasure chemicals, such as dopamine. And I started to understand that almost anything that gives you dopamine, you can become a little bit obsessed with. And that obsession could potentially lead to addiction through habitual, repeated overindulgence of it, right? Where you're just chasing it and chasing it and chasing it. And it might not have that chemical dependency quality that we think of, where like you're chemically dependent on alcohol, you know, or you're strung out on a drug. But I do think that the way that we're like lab rats with that drip, drip, drip of dopamine can cause us to chase down sensations and experiences, you know? So it's interesting, you know, thinking about, you know, I have been sober and slutty, you know, I've been sober and in open relationships where I felt like, inspired to just like seek out lots of different kinds of sex. And so I know that you can be.
You can.
It's sort of like you can sing karaoke without being wasted. You can have sex with a stranger without being wasted. You probably want to work up to that if you're used to doing it wasted only, you know? But
do you have to like kind of go through that like wasted time first in order to like get to, I guess, the other side where you're sober? Like, is that like part of the shadow work that we were just talking about?
I don't think it is for everyone. I think it is for me as an addict, but it's making me think of like when I was in high school, one of the girls that I hung out with was this girl who was like, I was hanging out with all these goth kids. We were all like kind of goth or alternative in the 80s. And she was a totally cute girl, but there was also nothing particularly super special about her, you know? She was like, you know, this was a crowd of people who had a lot of look, you know, like people were really doing big traditional goth looks. And like she didn't really. She was like kind of more of like a plain Jane goth, you know? And she also wasn't like the most outgoing personality. She had like a solid, totally sweet personality, but she also wasn't like super charismatic. And she was really slutty. And like, it was really wild because it was during a time where like we weren't that, like my friend group wasn't that slutty. Like we just weren't. And she was like hooking up in a way that we weren't. And like no one judged her, but we were also sort of like, huh, wow. Like, look at her go. And
the secret slut.
She was like a secret slut, but she wasn't shameful about it. She was super just like I mean, she was kind of like a hero in this weird way, you know? She was kind of doing it kind of perfectly, you know? Like, she just was like, sort of like, no big deal. She wasn't like being super flamboyant about it. She wasn't also being ashamed of it. Yeah, and she wasn't a big drinker. Like, I don't ever remember seeing her drunk. Like, she maybe drank with us, but like, certainly, I feel like she was a real glass of wine with dinner kind of a person, whereas me and my friends drank a little alcoholically even early on.
Yeah.
Whether or not we, you know, all of us became full-blown alcoholics like I did. Like, we certainly drank alcoholically on weekends and stuff. And she sort of like partook or didn't.
Yeah, yeah.
And seemed really comfortable with herself sexually and comfortable with, you know, having sex as a teenager, which I think is fraught. How can it not be fraught?
Yeah.
You know,
Oof.
even today, I think,
Yeah.
even today in a more permissive, maybe like geographical location in a cool family, I think it's still probably fraught, you know?
Definitely. The other thing that I noticed in your introduction is that you did not mention your own sex work. Was that strategic?
Oh, how interesting. No, not at all. Not at all strategic. I think maybe it's just so much in my past. I think that it's, you know, I think I was really thinking about myself as a slut in this moment, you know? And so that just isn't a layer right now, you know? And certainly there's also a question of like, for how long can you be like, you know, sex work identified when you haven't worked in decades? It's a little like, you know,
because I wanted to ask that question because I think it was in an interview or a passage where you were saying that you don't like to mention that you did sex work because sometimes it will be the only thing that people will focus on.
It's true. That is true. I don't care about that in the context of this book because I feel like the people who come to this anthology, I just trust are more nuanced than that. But yeah, for sure that I've had that experience where, you know, it can sort of just like the needle goes off the record and then that's what gets really focused on.
Yeah.
But you know, also the time the cultural conversation around sex work has changed so much since I did it, you know, only for the better, even though the situations, oh my God, situations have gotten, you know, arguably worse in a lot of ways for sex workers because of FOSTA and just like, you know, I will say hysteria around trafficking, which obviously trafficking in a real way is a horrible, traumatic, evil thing. But the way that it's applied to people who sort of use their own agency to go into sex work is really weird and problematic, you know, and has been used, just been like weaponized against sex workers, obviously. So, so yeah, I don't necessarily feel like that anymore, but I think there was a moment.
Yeah, for sure. That was just one of the things that popped up in my mind, so I wanted to ask you. But I just want to read this one passage before we move on from Vera Blossom's piece called "A New Myth for Slut." The slut is a shaman, communing with the spirit of sexuality that lingers within you. They pull something primal out of you. They regulate your body and bring you back in tune with our bestial nature. Sluts are healers, massaging the emotional and physical aches and pains that come from being a human. They help unravel the knot that work, death, disease, trauma, and capitalism tie into you. They are bringers of light and soothing. The slut is a planeswalker, communing with oblivion. She calls upon that ether that we come from when we are born and where we go to when we die. She invokes an orgasm, a constriction of your muscles, the palpitation of the heart, the paralysis of your nerves. She calls forth la petite mort, a mini death. The slut sometimes risks her life, knowing that there's always a chance she might fall into the void of oblivion at the hands of a cruel Johnny or in a freak sex accident. She knows that the man might lock her up for her actions, putting her in a cage until she dies. She knows it's all worth it, if it's in the pursuit of pleasure. Sluts are shepherds of life, bringing together people, creating new human beings, raising kids and each other. She keeps her community alive and thriving. She sees the shadows in the light and guides her family through life between the two. A slut is a know-it-all. She knows where to find all the fun. She knows no life is worth living without some dirty fucking fun. So,
I love Vera Blossom so much. She's
This was
so
so
incredible. We're publishing a whole book of her essays.
Oh wow! Okay,
in the fall.
I
Yeah,
can't wait to read that.
I'm excited for it to be unleashed.
Yeah,
upon
this
the
was an
world.
amazing piece.
It
It just the slut as a shaman really stood out to me. But I wanted to go back to the beginning of your life. You grew up in Chelsea, Massachusetts, to a working class family. Your father, Polish Catholic, and your mother, Irish, French Canadian. And at a young age, your dad left home and took his alcoholism with him. But he was soon replaced with your stepfather, who brought his own alcoholism. But you said that he was a fun alcoholic. And in high school, you said that you became obsessed with goth culture and idolized artists like Susie Sue. But at 18, you left home. So why did you leave home at that time? What pushed you out?
God, I mean, I actually left when I was more like 21 when I left.
Yeah.
I moved in really quickly with a girlfriend, very spontaneously, actually, even though we were kind of U-hauling it. Because my stepfather, I had learned had been like a peeping Tom. So it was something that I'd always suspected was going on. But
how did you know?
Really, how I knew was intuitively. I really know that I knew intuitively, but obviously none of us are taught to understand what that is or really trust it, you know? But you know, the intuition was backed up. There's just like a lot of weird things, you know, like him being really close to the doors, you know, and hearing creaking outside the doors, and just like really, like I knew in my gut that's exactly what was happening. But it's so easy to doubt your own intuition, and certainly the world encourages that. And I didn't necessarily want to do the research because I didn't really want to know, because it would have ruined everything, and it did ruin everything, you know, because it was true. And I ultimately did kind of investigate and found the proof. And what was really interesting—
How did you find the proof?
I found the proof by what really did it was that there was a wall in my bedroom, that the other side of the wall was the back hallway. And the back hallway in my house was very rarely used. Like you'd run downstairs to like go in the yard or into the cellar. It was like nobody spent time in the back hallway. And there was a piece of paneling sort of leaned up against the wall from when like a room had been paneled. This is like 80s New England. And if you moved the panel, you'd see that there was a big hole punched into the actual wall. And if you looked into the hole, you could look directly into my room, straight onto my bed. It almost looked panoramic. It was wild. And so if you went into my room and looked and found like, where is that notch? Where is that hole? You would see that it was in a place where two different slabs of paneling had come together, and the notch was sort of half on one panel, half on the other, like it had been
Wild.
Totally. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like it's not. And you know, my brain was wanting to challenge everything I saw to be like, well, no, there's this reason for it. It could be this. It could be that.
Well, because he was your father.
Yeah.
Figure, right?
Yeah. And he had legally adopted us, so he really was actually legally, you know, our father as well. But yeah, you know, and what was wild is that the more irrefutable like the evidence became, it didn't become any more believable, which was really interesting. You know, I still was like, I've got to be wrong. I still didn't trust it, even as it was looking me in the face. I was like, there's got to be something I'm not seeing. There's got to be something. And then on top of that, I kind of knew that he'd deny it. And so, and I knew that I didn't feel like, in the face of his denial, I would just like crack and just feel like shit. Like, oh my God, I'm such a monster that I'm accusing this guy of like the worst thing you could accuse a guy of, right? So I just didn't really do anything about it. And then I have a younger sister who's absolutely incredible. And she just like confronted him. And as expected, he denied. But instead of cracking, she was just like, no, like we know.
Yeah.
Like we know. Until he finally was like,
admitted it.
Yeah. So, and then when that happened, I kind of couldn't believe that like this thing that I had been wrestling with for years at that point, and had been the knowing and the sort of number that I did on myself sort of internally as a result of that, you know, of like feeling ashamed and squishing down my intuition and just like all these sort of really real but invisible internal consequences of that situation just sort of exploded. And I kind of couldn't believe like what I'd been through. And I just like left the house and just left because, you know, my mother was like really immediately like, well, he's sorry. So like, let's just kind of move on. And I was just like, wait, what? You know, it was like really inconceivable. And all of this was happening simultaneously with sort of me coming out as queer and also me getting a sort of feminist consciousness and a kind of a political awakening where like I'd always been sort of like politically savvy, but the depths of everything and the intersectionality of evils almost sort of became, it was sort of like my brain was like that, you know, like one of those like FBI maps, you know, with string maps on a wall like that. I was like, what? Racism and sexism and, you know, like everything, misogyny.
I remember
and
the
like,
feminist, you're so angry. Like,
oh God, yeah. I'm like, how has this been happening for literally forever and nobody is doing anything and nobody's even talking to me about it. Like I wasn't even raised with like oh, heads up, people hate women and you are one, you know, so just know that like, you know, sometimes it might feel like something's weird and it probably you know, just like shit like that. So yeah, it was just a very cataclysmic mentally and emotionally time for me. And so I didn't feel like I could live in the house, and I just sort of moved in with my girlfriend, which is things were heading there anyway, not because we'd been together for a long time and had a beautiful relationship, just because everything was really chaotic and we were together,
and
you know, constantly.
went to Arizona, right?
Yes, we went to Arizona because she had plans when I met her to go there, and it sounded really romantic to kind of like go there with her, you know, and get out of Boston. And, you know, I had been really afraid to go because I felt like kind of codependently attached to my family in this way. Like, and then when everything sort of split, I was like, oh, I'm free in this weird way. Like I can kind of do anything I want, you know? I mean, I was really attached to my sister, but I was always really trying to take her with me wherever I went. But like, she also had her own life, you know, and ambitions and stuff to follow. So,
yeah. So you land in Arizona. I think you're working a few jobs, but your girlfriend is a sex worker.
Well, when we landed in Arizona, we had both already done sex work. Actually, my girlfriend, unbeknownst to me, when we connected, was already a sex worker, and it took her a minute to share that with me for obvious reasons, you know. But I thought it was like really cool. You know, she just was like more of a badass, I thought, and like a rule breaker, and you know, then and sort of just like doing her own thing, you know, and a feminist, honestly. And it seems stupid to not do sex work when you're hanging out with sex workers. You're like, well, why wouldn't you? Like, you're literally just like, I don't know. I was working 2 jobs in Massachusetts. I was working at a hair salon part-time, and I was also working at like a deli part-time. And, you know, these are like low-paying jobs. And I come from lowly paid people, you know, and I had dropped out of university because I couldn't figure out how to keep paying for it. It seemed really overwhelming and possibly also not worth the effort, the extreme effort that it took. And then all of a sudden I'm among these people, you know, my girlfriend and her roommate, and they were both escorts. You know, they had all this money, they had all this cash. They weren't paying taxes to the horrible man. They weren't like, they had all this free time. They would just live, they were living these beautiful lives where they'd like go to the lake for the day and just like read books on the shore of the lake. And
that
like,
sounds nice.
It did sound nice. And like, I could never go with them because I was working so much, you know, and then they'd work at night, but there was something like really glamorous about it. You know, I did feel like there was something glamorous about their sex work. Like they would get all like dressed up in a costume. You know, it wasn't necessarily how they normally, it wasn't that different.
It was a character they were putting on.
It was a character. It was theater. And they had to go and have like mediocre to bad sex with men they weren't attracted to. And, you know, I had been in a sexual relationship with my boyfriend, my first boyfriend, for like 3 years. And I was always sort of psychologically interested and curious about the sex that we had. I don't want to paint it like I never liked the sex that we had, because I did, but there was a lot of times that I didn't necessarily. And like, I just didn't understand my relationship to my own sexuality and what I liked and what I didn't like. And I understood that I think I could totally just have sex with random strangers, and it's like not something that's going to like destroy my soul, you know, like the way that we're taught, I think, as women, like our sexuality is so precious, and if it's mishandled,
it needs to remain
devastated,
pure.
you know? And and I just think that can be, I don't know, like I don't want to tell anybody obviously how to interpret and hold their own sexuality, because, you know, sexuality can be really sacred and beautiful and magical, and it also can be very, really pedestrian and like uninspired and like the opposite of sacred, and it can be that way in the same person, and one doesn't negate the other. Do you know what I mean? Like just because you're able to have sort of like lousy sex with this person that you have walked into, you know, consented to having this crappy sex for money, does not mean that you also, it doesn't negate like the beautiful sacred sex you had with somebody that you were connected with, you know? And I don't know how I kind of understood that, but I did, you know, I did understand that sexuality was really vast and varied, and that for whatever reason, maybe it's because I'm a detached Aquarius, I don't know, I could have this kind of sex and be curious about what it was.
Sluts, I need you to stop what you're doing and follow the show wherever you're listening and rate it 5 stars. You can also follow me on Instagram at Caitlin Dryden and at Slut Podcast. And you can also find me on TikTok at SLT Pod. This is a one slut production right now. So I'm doing everything from engineering it to mixing it to doing social content. And it's a lot. It's a lot for one woman to do. So I really need you to show me love in this way so I can grow the show and, you know, hopefully bring some people on to help me out here, because I'm putting a lot of my pussy into this, and I love it, but I also need some love from you. And so I thank you in advance for doing all these things. It really means a lot to me. And also, while you're here, make sure you give our guest, Michelle T, some love on Instagram. She's at Michelle TZ, and she's also on X at T Michelle. And make sure you purchase Sluts. It is wherever you can find books, and it's a great book. It's one that you need as a slut in your library. So you should go ahead and get that. Links to all these and much more are in the description to this episode. Anyways, let's get back to the show. Here is Michelle T. So you and your girlfriend, you're together, you're doing this sex work.
Yeah.
And what you guys do to say fuck you to the man is you, after you have sex with these men, you do your work, you call them.
We crank call them.
You prank call them.
Yeah.
You tell their wives.
Yeah.
You make fun of them for their kinks.
Yeah.
I mean,
we kink shame
that
them.
is
It's so mean. It's so mean.
It's mean, but I mean, it's funny.
It was really funny at the time. And it was so great at the time. And, you know, obviously, you know, I think, you know, kink shaming is unkind, and I certainly have my share of kinks that could be shamed. But yeah, you know, there was just something, it's very complicated, right? It's like if you believe in the right for prostitution to exist, then you believe in the right for, you know, people to purchase the services of a prostitute. You know, you literally can't have one without another, right? And it's like, if you want to wish a prostitute well, you wish them a lot of business, a lot of safe and happy, easy business, which means a lot of people buying their services, which means a lot of men who feel empowered to purchase sexual services from women, right?
Yeah.
But it felt really complicated to me. And it remains complicated. I'm just not in the thick of it as I was, you know? And being in the thick of it in my 20s as I was trying to sort out
having this feminist awakening.
Yeah. It was like just so shocking to me that like, okay, here's the situation. I'm a prostitute and you're a John, and I'm I have walked into this, transactional role for the moment. And as a result, I've put myself in mortal danger. I've put myself in, all this societal danger, right? There, like my reputation could be besmirched. Like who knows what ambitions I may someday have that are now off the table because of this. Should I have children, depending on where I live and what the era is, who knows how that, could be a problem. It's like, by making this decision, I'm putting so many aspects of my life at risk. And this guy's fine. He's so fine. He's not worried that I'm going to kill him. He's not worried that it's going to hurt his ambitions, like, oh my God, what's the most that's going to happen? Even if it like came out in even if he was running for mayor and it was like, he saw a prostitute, who would really care?
And they haven't.
Right.
We know Donald Trump.
We know that. Yeah. They could do much worse than that.
Yeah.
So that power dynamic was so mind blowing for me. And it's like, obviously I understood that power dynamic and that double standard intellectually, but to be like really standing in it was so unacceptable that I was like, I have to do something to make this person feel unsafe. I have to do something to level the playing field somehow, and certainly through feminist activism and sex work activism and visibility, making efforts to level the playing field in the way that I'm raising the safety of sex workers, but also increasing the unsafe, the lack of safety in men also seemed really important and often a lot easier and more immediate.
Do you feel any regret about doing that? Or do you feel like you're just like, I did it, it's fine, I move on?
I mean, I don't feel regret just because, I often think about regret, and I just think when you feel regret, you've really lost touch with what it felt like to be you in that moment, the truth of being you in that moment, the reality, and that's not to say I would do it now, because that wouldn't necessarily be my reality now, but I really felt like so vulnerable, and I needed to remind these humans that they too are vulnerable, and that maybe I could be a little bit dangerous, and women could be a little bit dangerous, not that, I mean, whatever, you can really get deep in it. And, was there anything really that sex workers in general were to gain from men thinking they're dangerous? Probably not, because men ultimately still have more power. And so, the way that you're safe really in a lot of those situations is that men don't think you're dangerous. Right. But I liked to crank call them and be a nuisance and make them feel a little scared. Like, what have I done? And I liked to steal things from their house. I really liked that a lot. I got really into that for a minute. I didn't necessarily, we weren't really out. I say we, because I did this with my girlfriend and our friends. Everyone got really into it. We're all like, these guys suck. Like, let's fucking do this for the goddess, It was more like we were crank calling the guy, and then if the woman sort of got involved, we would just be like, hey, like we weren't really trying to hurt the women, I felt sort of neutral about them, I often did feel a little compassionate for them, because I had, my sister was straight, a straight lady, and I'm just like, straight ladies just end up with bad dudes, and it's like not really their fault always. It's like, what options?
Yeah, what are your chances? I know you're kind of like picking the pot.
You want love, you want sex, you want romance. Like, you're gonna pick someone, and like, what was the pool that you were picking from? So But I also at the same time was just like, I don't know. Maybe you should know that your husband's seeing prostitutes, not to hurt you necessarily, but like maybe you just want to know that about your life.
I want to turn to your book soon, Valencia, which you came out with in 2000. But I just want to touch on something before we start talking about that. In Against, you wrote, to love queers was to love damage. To love damage was a path to loving yourself. What did you mean by that?
Well, I just think that, coming of queer age in the 90s, meaning you had grown up in the 60s, 70s, 80s, that was like, the homophobia was so violent and terrible, I mean, like, wow. So there was really no way to like not have grown up with trauma. And, you know, arguably we all grew up with trauma, right? In various ways. But the specific trauma of growing up queer had left its mark on everyone. And there was no way, I almost want to say there was no way to be in a healthy relationship, even though that sounds so dramatic. But I think for anyone to learn how to be in healthy romantic relationships kind of is a little bit of trial and error, you know? And I just think it was a lot of trial and error because we weren't necessarily in healthy relationship to ourselves, to the larger culture. There was a lot of unhealed trauma that hadn't necessarily been looked at. You know, we were, by and large, we were not a resourced people. We didn't have access to money because, you know, we weren't very hireable. We hadn't necessarily gone to school. We'd been cut off from, you know, parental sources of wealth, et cetera. Even folks who grew up with money didn't necessarily have
access.
So it was, you know, it was a real, like deeply under-resourced community and very DIY. And, but you know, it's hard to DIY like mental health care, right? It's hard to DIY like therapy. So there wasn't really a lot of that. And certainly everyone would certainly have benefited from it. There was a lot of just like caring for each other. And part of that care was a real lack of judgment for people's sort of behavior, you know, when it was destructive or weird. And a lot of that was really beautiful. And important. And then a lot of that was sort of like putting up with a lot of stuff that maybe you didn't need to put up with. But also there was, what was the alternative, you know, to be alone, you know, because we were just trying to figure out how to be humans in a culture that told us like that we weren't humans, you know, and even no matter how much, you know, that's bullshit, you can't help but be hurt by that and internalize that on some level. So yeah. You know, like you stood by people, you know, who were hurt and damaged because you also knew that you were hurt and damaged and you wanted somebody to be there for you. You couldn't really.
So you put up with mistreatment of.
Mistreatment or just, strangeness. And, you know, it was a really wild time. And you just took it for granted that everyone around you was a little crazy, and that became sort of like maybe great, you know what I mean? And that maybe crazy meant like was a really like emphatic fuck you to a lot of things that needed to hear fuck you, you know? And so there was just different ways of thinking about it.
What do you think you learned about relationships from that time?
I mean, I do think that, you know, the learning curve was pretty steep, but I do think that everyone was sort of slowly learning how to be in healthy relationship to each other and to themselves, right? I think that learning to sort of value imperfection and not put such a prize on like being completely like well-adjusted or whatever, you know, and the sort of falseness of that, you know, like that. I think that, you know, if you maybe think about people outside of that who are maybe straight or sort of more normcore or whatever, like, you know, there's a pressure to be really perfect, I think, right? To be sane, to be all of these things that is really unreasonable. It's a really unreasonable request under capitalism, you know?
To be perfect.
Yeah. To be like mentally healthy, you know? It's like, so, you know, to a certain extent, we gave each other a lot of grace to have, I think, reasonable reactions to the world around us, you know? And honestly, it's amazing that we all weren't more unhinged because there was so much against us, like that we were as functional. And
you could have been more unhinged.
That we were as functional and compassionate as we were, I think was really incredible.
So now I want to turn to your memoir, Valencia, which was released in 2000 and shot to queer literary fame. And it's been pruned and prodded at for a few decades now. Even a movie's been made about the book. But I was really struck by your self-awareness in the introduction. The first line goes, "What's more narcissistic than writing your own memoir? Writing an introduction to your own memoir." And then you go on to say on page 8, "That's the strangest part about turning your life into a story. Not the social fallout, the way you overexpose yourself, the way others will inevitably think you're a narcissistic egomaniac who can't get enough of herself. The hardest part is writing it down petrifies your experience, freezes it in time. You have to believe the story is true to put it on paper. At least I do. But for normal, healthy, non-writer people, the way you view life ideally shifts with time and perspective. If you've rolled your history into a book and then performed that book over and over, it can be hard for distance to set in and nuance the past. And when it eventually does, it feels confusing, embarrassing, and humbling. So can you talk about the mental illness that is memoir and why you're so attracted to it?
Right. I mean, I think I'm attracted. I think the attraction to it is sort of nebulous and like, for whatever reason, I'm sort of wired that way. I've always sort of narrated my own experience in my head a lot, and I don't know why. But wait, what was the first part of your question?
Just talk about the mental illness.
The mental illness that is memoir. Yes. Oh my gosh. Well, this funny thing happened where I was reading this book that that really influenced me. It's called The Midnight Disease. And I'm sorry, I can't remember the author's name right now, but it's a woman who's like a neuroscientist and, studied the brain. And she was pregnant and she went through a very traumatic miscarriage. And in the wake of that, she became hypographic, which is that she became intensely compelled to write. And the writing was personal, writing her own experience.
Interesting.
And that had never happened to her before. And she was really consumed with it.
Yeah.
And it really struck me because the way she spoke about the compulsion and the intense desire to specifically write her own story felt so relatable. The way she talked about it, I was like, wow, that's me. And then to think that this was a sort of condition that was born of trauma. And then when I thought about when I began writing, and I've always written, but when I really began writing in earnest and really focusing on my own experience, how I was sort of like riddled with trauma and like processing trauma, I was like, oh shit, is that what happened to me? And then I made a career out of it. I like nurtured it, and I think that's really possible. The mental illness part, like I say it as a joke, but there's obviously a kernel of truth in it. And whenever I say it to other writers who write memoir or personal narrative, they always sort of like chuckle knowingly, like they're embarrassed that they were seen, So there's clearly something that's in there, but it's also mysterious. Very, very much the compulsion to write can feel like the compulsion to drink or the compulsion to, do something crazy. And that sort of flow state that you can get in when it's going really well, there's something mental that's going on there. I feel like that writing is really, for me, my experience of writing, it does engage those neurochemicals, right? The dopamine and all that stuff that for me is also tied to, addiction, which is, potentially a mental illness, right? So it's all just like, it's all part and parcel of my sort of busted brain, and
you're sorting through, I guess, all of your experiences, what's going on. I really like related to this and because, I there's some narcissistic quality about having your own podcast, right?
Yeah.
And having the compulsion to talk about your experiences on a public level. And I always struggle with talking about things in real time because I often feel that within days, sometimes hours, minutes, the way I reflect on what is going on changes. And I have such fear over like putting something out there and then changing my mind. So this just really rang true to me, talking about this. And I guess, how do you what does writing do for you? Like what is the thrill of writing for you?
I mean, like, what does it do for me internally? Like, it feels like a release, like something will build up, like I can feel a story sort of building in me. So to sit down and actually do the writing and I'm engaging, it's almost like there's this little hamster spinning in a wheel and I'm like letting it out of its cage and I'm like, run free, and there's something satisfying and correct feeling about it. It's like to a certain extent, it's something that's happening all the time, whether or not I'm sitting down and writing it or not. So it's sort of looking at that part of my mind and letting it do what it's kind of begging to do. Yeah. And it feels, sometimes it feels really hard. Sometimes it feels like a lot of flow. Sometimes it feels like both. Another aspect of how it feels like a mental illness, I think, is the way that any writer is forced to engage with their mind in the course of writing, right? And like have to evaluate, is it good? Is it bad? What is it? What, ask all these questions. Yeah, you're like interrogating yourself all the time, which is like fucking mentally ill.
It's so interesting that you said the hamster wheel, because I was watching some of your early spoken performances in San Francisco from the 90s on YouTube. Some of them are up there. And you are talking so fast. The way you're talking, but it's interesting because it's almost like you can see the wheels spinning in your head, and you're trying to get it out as quickly as it's coming to you. Yeah. And I was going to ask you about that, because I was like, I've noticed this way that she talks. It's really interesting. It's thrilling to like watch you talk at that time, because it's almost like your lips can't keep up with what's going on in your head.
It's really true. And I think that, not to make it so sort of practical, but it's also the era that I discovered caffeine and I started drinking coffee, and it really worked for me. Yeah. I loved it a lot, just like I would go on to love cocaine and crystal meth. I loved coffee, and I would just be drinking coffee and writing and stuff, and there was a little bit of maybe hypomania, which I think, I'm never a person that has experienced literal mania, but I do feel like there's something in my nature where I maybe kind of head in that direction. My compass is pointed over there, but I haven't, so yeah. And there was also this sort of, it did feel very urgent. Getting it out all felt very urgent. It felt like, my life felt urgent, and I felt like the lives of the people around me felt urgent. And I felt like the way in which we weren't really being heard, felt urgent, or maybe we were being heard a little bit. Maybe there was some rumbles in the culture that I could add my voice to. It felt really urgent. And I'm just sort of, I am sort of a fast and impulsive person. So there's that too. But I feel like it was all sort of coalescing into this style. And there's nerves involved too. That's another thing. Is like, as I'm doing all of that, I'm really nervous. And excited.
You have the energy from the crowd as well coming at you. Do you think that memoir is healing or heartbreaking?
Gosh, probably both. I've always really resisted the idea that it's healing and cathartic, because I don't know, there's something about it that rubbed me the wrong way. And now thinking about it, it could be that it takes what is a literary art form and it makes it into this weird pathological, therapy session for women, right?
Yeah.
Or
there's this great quote. I can't remember who said it. That all art, like the idea that all art has to be like some therapy mission is like complete bullshit. You can just make art if you want to make art. It doesn't have to have some bigger meaning.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. But it's hard because there's a lot of pressure from capitalism. And by capitalism, I mean both the literal marketplace of books and also the nonprofit industrial complex that likes to give grants and rewards. Both of these systems really reward that, and it can be really frustrating because sometimes your art does have that quality to it, and sometimes it doesn't.
Yeah.
And I don't think anybody should be forced in either direction. It's really weird. And certainly, I don't know that like male writers have felt that pressure to the same extent that female writers have. Or queer writers, trans writers, to have to sort of mine our experience for goodies from the culture. And it's weird. I do think that sometimes it has those qualities, and both of them, and they're contradictory qualities in a sense, right? Like sometimes it is healing, sometimes it is heartbreaking. I think that when you're writing about trauma, the trauma doesn't necessarily go away, but your relationship to it changes, and maybe that's what healing is, right? But it's not the hero's journey upwards. It's not a straight line. It can be really complicated. Like sometimes, I can be reminded of traumas and, I'm in a particular place and I feel like some distance from it and I can see that I'm in a really different place. And then other times, like maybe I feel like wounded by life.
Mm-hmm.
And then
Yeah.
I remember, or I'm brought into proximity to an old trauma, and it feels compounded all of a sudden,
Yeah.
you know? And I just think that, you know, again, it also feels like very female, like that, like we're supposed to survive our trauma. We're supposed to get an A+ in surviving our trauma, right? We're supposed to like, we're supposed to heal it. Yeah, heal it. So you can like be like a role model or something, or like, and it's like, you know, I think that I have healed a ton of my trauma, and I think it's also still there, you know? And it's like, yeah, it's to think that like, if my urge to write, which is so mysterious, winds up healing trauma, then that's a lovely thing that happened.
Yeah.
But it certainly wasn't what I was setting out to do.
Yeah.
And I don't think writers should. And I think a lot of writers who say that it's just marketing. Even if they don't realize that it's marketing, I think it's marketing, you know? Yeah.
Yeah. So when you're 32, you finally decide to get sober. What pushed you to making that decision?
God, a lot of compounded insanity for years, you know, like it's not like I was unaware of the reality of alcoholism in the world and certainly in my family. You know, I knew since I was young, since I was an alcoholically drinking teenager, I understood that I was at risk of becoming an alcoholic. Like my mother was always really clear to me, you know, when she would find out that I had been drinking, which inevitably would happen. I'd get caught or something would happen. You know, she would be like, you know, you have alcoholics in your family. Like you can't play around with this. And I didn't take her seriously because it would have been a bummer too.
Yeah. It's also like, Mom, shut up.
Yeah, exactly. You know, like, you know, I just like didn't really respect her authority or her wisdom, you know? And certainly there were legitimate reasons for that, but I kind of threw the baby out with the bathwater a little bit. But yeah, And then when I moved to San Francisco and suddenly was part of queer nightlife, like that all happens in bars, right? And so why wouldn't I have a drink? And then, you know, I think, you know, the way my drinking is that like I never just had one drink. You know, why wouldn't I have 3 drinks? I'm still here.
What's the point of having one drink?
Yeah. Totally. You know, and the thing is also like there's even something like, and this is so alcoholic, or it's common among alcoholics, that like you can have like, I don't know, like my sister, for example, like had like a really bad experience drinking when she was young. And so she kind of stopped drinking, you know, or she understood, oh, if I do that,
it's gonna.
Yeah. Like I also had bad experiences, but I was like, this is interesting. You know, like there's just something even about feeling a little bit sick or something. You're just like, oh, it's going to happen, you know? And like, you know, you try to avoid that. Like, how can I avoid that? How can I keep drinking and just like not have that happen again or whatever? But yeah, I just, I always knew that it was a possibility. I guess I could say I was haunted by the possibility that I would become an alcoholic.
It was like a whisper.
Yeah. And I certainly knew I loved to drink, you know, and I certainly knew that at some point drinking had become part of my identity, which is so stupid. And to say it sounds so dumb, you know, but it really did. It was sort of like the way I was like a girl or a queer was like, or even a feminist was
There's a
like,
righteousness about it. Yeah, no, I have like somebody who's like a friend of mine, and it's definitely a part of his identity. It's like he feels like proud.
It feels like it's a fuck you or something.
Yeah,
but it's not.
Also a writer.
Oh, right. So, well, there's such a great history of that, right? I mean, we can really justify so much just from looking at that, and then add the feminism to it that I'd be looking at, you know, say like Bukowski or Kerouac or Hunter Thompson, and being like, man, they can do it and they're celebrated, but you know, I do it and I'm like, you know, I'm what, a slut, right? Or whatever. So it felt, you know, I got a lot of mileage out of it, like intellectual mileage, identity mileage, bravado, all of that.
You said that you would love to like write, drink, and smoke.
Oh, I loved it so much.
See,
it was so great.
There's such a romance in that. Like
I mean, it's when I think about it now, it's like really being in the heart of that sort of completely ravenous dragon that's inside of you that wants all these things, like those compulsions and cravings are all alive and they're all being sort of satisfied.
Yeah.
Right? I'm giving myself the alcohol I'm craving. I'm giving myself the cigarettes I'm craving. I'm giving myself the self-obsession I'm craving, this release to this narration in my head. The dopamine is flowing. The tolerance for the dopamine hasn't really been built up yet. So it's working, you know? I think, you know, I know, you know, what happens is that, you know, you fuck up your dopamine receptors. And so that's what tolerance is. And that's when it stops working. But yeah, you know, when it worked, it was so great. But, you know, it doesn't really work for that long. And then another thing, you know, like in recovery, people say like, you know, first it was good times and then it's good times and consequences. And then it's just consequences.
Yeah.
And the consequences was a really interesting thing to think about because I had arranged my life, and also life had been arranged for me by virtue of being broke, a queer person, all this other stuff, that like I was living pretty close to the ground. So there wasn't a big height to fall from. I didn't have a great job that I was going to fuck up, you know? I didn't have like a family and kids, you know, I was living in a punk house with other punks who fucked up all the time. And so
it's almost weird if you're not fucking up.
It was weird when people did. Sometimes people moved into this like rotating cast of roommates and they were really functional and they just did not fit in. It was really
I'm too functional for this.
Yeah. You know, people being like, well, is it okay if I clean? And you're like, I guess so. If that's what you're into, you know, you can clean, but we're not going to do that. So so, you know, it took longer in a sense for the consequences to accumulate or to matter, you know, and they really started mattering, I think, when they started affecting my sort of joie de vivre, which I've always been sort of blessed with. And it is, I think, a consequence of, not a consequences, but, you know, it's a result of part of this having so much Sagittarius in my chart is that I'm kind of jolly, you know, and this is a very double-edged sword about Sagittarius is, but there's an element of optimism that like, surely everything will turn out okay, you know? And, you know, even though as I've seen throughout my life, like things not necessarily turning out okay, in a certain sense, they also did turn out okay. Like I always landed on my feet. Obviously there's like white privilege and other kinds of privileges that, you know, assisted in that being my reality. But, you know, it all just sort of like cohered for me to think like, yeah, it's fine. Everything's gonna be fine. And then that just sort of got worn down, you know, and I became depressed, dramatically depressed, you know, really hysterically depressed.
Like any good writer.
I guess so. But, you know, the question is, can you make art out of it and make it worthwhile? And when I was in that state,
how do you get yourself out of that depression?
Right. Because for me, I was not able to create within it. My writing really sucked. It was not good. When I was bottoming out. And so, you know, it, the consequences just sort of like, I was depressed. I was having a lot of fights with my partner. And I was so, in the midst of them, I was so sure that it was their fault. And then I'd wake up in the morning and realize I was wasted. And I couldn't be sure in the morning that it was their fault. And that fucked me up all the time. Like, I felt like I'd become an unreliable narrator to my own interiority, and it made me feel.
And that's a really important part. You have to trust your own story, is what you're saying.
Yeah, I mean, it makes you feel really fucking crazy if you don't. And I did feel really crazy and unbalanced, and it was terrible. And you know, and then there was a couple instances where I became, I was too sick from drinking to show up for some literary engagements. And that was a red flag to me that I'm grateful that I saw, because it's one thing to call in sick to work, because fucking who cares about work? You know what I mean? But there's another thing to call in sick to your writing, your reason, your, you know,
your passion.
Yeah. And so it's like, wow, that's something, you know? And I had a revelation that I kind of saw in this way. I got this beautiful moment of clarity that I would be able to accommodate myself to every new low that I experienced as a result of drinking and using drugs. Everything that happened, you know, when you first start, or when you're not maybe super addicty, or, you know, it's like, you're like, well, I don't drink by myself. You know, like you have these sort of things where you're like, these are how I know I'm not an alcoholic, or this is how I know everything's okay. And then one of those things happens and you're like, oh, it's not so bad. I'm still here. I'm still me. It's fine. You know, you're like, oh, I guess I thought about that wrong. It's actually not that big of a deal to miss an event that I really was really important to me, or to like poop my pants while I'm in public, you know, because like my my like system is so fucked up from like just having fed it nothing but alcohol, you know? So like all these things I just started understanding like, oh, this can go on infinitely.
Yeah.
And this is how people who are so addicted that you do see, you know, I mean, our culture suffers, I think, from thinking an alcoholic is only like the bum in the street, right? Who, you know, is just sort of like beyond, but you're like, oh, that's how that person becomes that.
Yeah.
Like at some point they're where I am right now, you know, and that seems impossible.
Yeah.
But I got a moment of clarity where I'm like, I think that certain things I'm okay with were things that I was formerly impossible and not okay. And so that scared me. I'm really grateful and lucky to have had always sober people around me. So I did, you know, I had like a writing mentor who was sober, who I really like respected more than anybody in the world. And at one point I was trying to get sober on my own, trying to stop drinking. And I had enough success with it that I felt I could share it with them that I was doing that. And they were really supportive and they didn't push recovery on me or anything. Even though I knew that was what they did. And then they came to visit me in San Francisco, and I was, you know, after having that one sort of run of sobriety on my own, I kind of fell off and I was never able to get back on again, which is not uncommon for alcoholics. And I just literally hadn't been able to stop. Even though I wanted to stop all the time, I then didn't want to stop all the time. And it was like that seesaw was really, really awful. And so I met my friend for coffee when they came to town, and they were like, how's not drinking? And I just burst into tears. I was really fragile. And I was like, I can't stop drinking. You know, I just told them, and they were like, let's go to a meeting. And they just like whipped out their phone. They found out where there was a meeting in San Francisco. I'm like, you live in New York City. How do you even know about? I was like, what secret society do you belong to? You know, it just seemed so kind of cool. I admired it. I was like, oh, they're so capable and resourced. You know, it was like admirable. And again, like this person could do no wrong. And they found a meeting. We went to it, and it was old information. There was no meeting there. So they were like, okay, listen, we're going to try again. We're going to go in the morning. So I went home, manufactured a huge fight with my partner at the time, which was not hard to do because we fought all the time. But then there was this thing where like, if we fought, I could feel really like a martyr. And then that would give me an excuse to get fucked up, you know? Yeah. So I think there was nothing in the house, but they were a pothead. So I abusively smoked weed, which was like never been my thing. And then I was just like, had this like miniature temporary break with reality where I was like, you're plastic. Everything's plastic. And like my partner was like, no, you don't get to lose your mind. No, like, no, you're not allowed to lose your mind. And I was like, haha, you know, and woke up in the morning and went to a meeting and have not drank alcohol since then.
Yeah.
So,
wow.
Yeah.
Good for you.
I know. And it, you know, I'm really grateful that this person brought me. It was like they came to town when I needed them to come to town. The person who spoke at this meeting, I did not relate to at all. They were a cis white man who was a Christian missionary, which I think is one of the most evil things a person can spend time doing on earth. But when they talked about being an alcoholic, it all made sense. And I was like, oh, wow, I have the same thing this person has. Like that's inarguable. Like I can't argue with that. And then, you know, everybody else in the room had really nice skin, and like my skin was really fucked up from drinking. Like I just looked like shit, you know? And I was like, oh, everyone looks so pretty and healthy and I want to look like that, you know? And
sometimes vanity can bring you far, honestly.
100%. It really helped me because it just was a visual. It was helpful to see on the outside. All of these things were happening on the inside, but I could practice as I was in denying my intuition and telling myself to stop thinking about the things I'm thinking about. I was able to ignore them. But then when I would look in the mirror and see that my hair wasn't holding color anymore and my face was really blotchy and weird, and I was like, oh,
it's time. Yeah. You can pick up a copy of Sluts wherever you find your books starting on May 7th. And if you're listening to this before that, you can pre-order it online now. Make sure to give Michelle T some love on Instagram at MichelleTX and on Twitter at TMichelle. Thank you, Michelle, for coming on the show and for giving us so much of your time. It was so valued, and I just loved hearing your story and researching it. So yeah, thank you so much again. And be sure to keep an eye on what's to come with Dopamine Press in the following years and months. I'm sure there's going to be some great queer novels coming up. Also, make sure you follow Slut and rate it 5 stars wherever you're listening. And make sure you're following at Slut Podcast and at Caitlin Dryden on Instagram and at SLT Pod on TikTok. If you're listening to this and you would like to watch it, you can do so on YouTube and Spotify. And if you're just a listener of the show, give me some love on YouTube. Hit that subscribe button. It really helps me out, even if you don't listen there. And if you'd like to, you can purchase a Slut sticker pack at slut-pod.com. That's slut-pod.com. Links to all these and more are in the description to this episode. Slut is hosted by me, Caitlin Dryden, and I edited and engineered this episode. And yeah, it was a lot of work, if you were wondering. Yeah, it was. Graphics are by Keisha Gargarello, and the song is also by me, but I did have some help from Corinne Davis and Michael Mason. And thank you for getting slutty with me. I will be back very soon with a solo episode, so don't worry. You'll hear from me, and I can't wait to talk to you then. Bye, sluts.